Dr. Alistair Finch came to Australia to debunk the Great Emu War as a military farce. He expected incompetent soldiers and panicked birds. What he found in the censored archives was impossible: tactical formations, coordinated retreats, and missing Aboriginal people. Now, standing in the outback darkness as shadows with razor-sharp claws circle his campfire, he realizes the most terrifying truth of all: some wars aren't fought against animals, but against ancient guardians whose rage has been awakened. The hushed reverence of the National Archives reading room was a balm to Dr. Alistair Finch. It was a place of order, of quiet truth, where the chaotic clamour of the past was tamed, catalogued, and filed into submission. He sat at a grand oak table, a solitary island in a sea of silent scholars, his personal space a testament to a mind that abhorred clutter. His pens lay in a perfect parallel line. His notepads were squared to the table's edge. His digital scanner hummed with quiet efficiency, inhaling the brittle pages of history and converting them into clean, searchable data. On the screen of his laptop, the title of his life's current work shone in crisp, sans serif font: Feather's Folly, a definitive debunking of the Great Emu War of 1932. Alistair permitted himself a small, self-satisfied smirk. The Emu War. It was the laughingstock of military history, a footnote of such sublime absurdity that most serious academics wouldn't touch it. But Alistair saw it as the perfect subject. It was a case study in farce, a historical moment so thoroughly illogical it begged for a logical mind to put it in its proper, ridiculous context. He leaned back, adjusting the tweed jacket that was as much a part of his uniform as his skepticism. He was reading the transcribed journal of a Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery, the man tasked with leading the glorious campaign. Meredith's account, written in a florid, almost desperate hand, described the emu's uncanny ability to withstand machine gun fire. "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds," Meredith lamented, "it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." Alistair let out a short, sharp scoff that was swallowed by the room's thick silence. "Invulnerability," he muttered to the empty chair beside him, his voice a dry whisper. "Or perhaps your men just couldn't hit the broadside of a barn-sized bird." He typed a new sentence into his manuscript, the words flowing with the easy confidence of a man who knows he is right. The soldiers' accounts, while colourful, attribute tactical genius to what was, in reality, a combination of the emu's instinctual panic and the gunner's startling incompetence. He loved this part of the process, taking the messy, emotional, human accounts of the past and distilling them into cold, hard, verifiable fact. He was a filter, a purifier. He brought order to the chaos of memory. For Alistair, history wasn't a story. It was a data set. And the data on the Emu War all pointed to one conclusion: a public relations disaster born from agricultural panic. Nothing more. He took a sip of his cold tea, the satisfaction settling comfortably in his chest. This book would be his masterpiece of demystification. An hour later, the initial box of high-level summaries was processed, its contents scanned and neatly filed into digital folders. Alistair retrieved the next box from his cart. This one was older, the cardboard softened by time, the label written in a spidery, faded script. Emu War, Field Reports, Campion District. This was the granular data, the raw feed from the front lines of the absurd conflict. He worked his way through the stack, his scanner humming its monotonous tune. Most reports were exactly what he expected: logistical nightmares, ammunition counts, complaints about the heat, and frustrated descriptions of the birds simply running away. It was mundane, tedious, and perfect for his thesis. Then he picked up a file that felt different. The paper was heavier, the folder itself bound by a string that had long since fused with the cardboard. He untied it carefully. Inside, the first page was a standard report form, but the body of the text was jarring. Several long paragraphs were obscured by thick black bars of censorship, the ink so heavy it had soaked through the page. This was unusual. Censorship was common for strategic details or personnel matters, but in a pest control operation, it made no sense. Alistair held the page up, angling it against the overhead lamp. The Censor S ink was old, but in the raking light, he could just make out the impression of the words beneath. They weren't full sentences, just fragments, ghosts of language. But the words he could discern sent a tiny, dissonant chime through the ordered cathedral of his mind. Unnatural formations seemed to anticipate our movements. Flanked the gunners from the west. A coordinated retreat, not a panicked scatter. He frowned, leaning closer. Flanked? Coordinated? These were terms of strategy, of intelligence. They were utterly incongruous with the behavior of emus. It had to be the overwrought imagination of a sun-addled soldier. And yet, the censorship remained. Why redact a soldier's hyperbole? His eyes scanned to the bottom of the page, below the final black bar. There, in the margin, was a small, spidery note in a different hand. Written in what looked like hurried pencil, the writing was faint, almost erased by time. It read, C-File Civ Dep 1932, WA. Hold for review. Alistair stared at the note. Civdep. Civilian disappearances? He felt a prickle of something that was not quite excitement, but a sharper, more focused form of curiosity. An untidy thread. A piece of data that didn't fit. He carefully placed the report in a separate folder, stood up, and walked out of the silent reading room. His previously calm and measured stride now filled with a new, urgent purpose. The archives counter was a barrier of polished wood and bureaucratic indifference. Behind it sat Mr. Graves, a man who seemed to have been carved from the same solid, unyielding oak. He was in his 60s, with a face that looked like it had been perpetually disappointed by incoming requests. He was the human embodiment of a rubber stamp that only ever imprinted the word no. Mr. Graves, Alistair began, placing his request slip on the counter. I need to requisition a file. It was referenced in a document from the Emu War collection. Graves took the slip without looking at him, his eyes fixed on his computer monitor. He typed in the file number with two slow, deliberate fingers. Civ Dep 1932 WA. Alistair watched the man's face. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a subtle shift. Graves' S back straightened. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stopped typing and looked at Alistair for the first time, his eyes as grey and flat as a winter sky. I'm sorry, Dr. Finch, he said, the apology utterly devoid of sincerity. That file is classified under the Official Secrets Act of 1911. It is not available for public review. Alistair felt a flash of irritation. That can't be right. It's a 1932 civilian file from Western Australia, not a wartime intelligence brief. And as I said, it was directly referenced in an Army field report. It's clearly related to my research. Graves' S gaze didn't waver. It is not part of the Emu War collection. Its inclusion in that box was a clerical error. A clerical error that was noted on the document itself? Alistair pressed, leaning forward slightly. Mr. Graves, I am an accredited military historian. My research is for a significant academic publication. I just need to see the file to understand the context of the field report. The man's face seemed to harden, to close itself off completely. He was no longer a clerk. He was a wall. The file concerns an unrelated internal affairs matter from that period. It is sealed. That is all the information I can provide. End of discussion. Graves turned his attention back to his monitor, a clear and final dismissal. Alistair stood there for a moment, the blood humming in his ears. This was not the polite, rule-based world of academia he knew. This was a slammed door, a locked box. He looked from Graves's rigid back to the polished counter. A a barrier not just of wood, but of deliberate institutional secrecy. The official narrative, he realized, wasn't just incomplete, it was being actively protected. And as he walked away from the counter, the last vestiges of his smug certainty about a farcical war evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp question that burned far brighter than mere academic curiosity. What, exactly, were they hiding? Mr. Graves' dismissal was a declaration of war, not a war of guns and soldiers, but Alistair Finch's kind of war, a battle of information. If the front door was locked, bolted, and guarded by bureaucratic dragons, he would find a side entrance. The official archive had failed him, so he retreated to his own fortress of solitude, the university library, long after the students and faculty had fled, leaving him alone with the ghosts of forgotten knowledge. The silence here was different from the archives. It was lonelier, deeper. The only sound was the soft squeak of his own shoes on the linoleum as he moved through the towering stacks of the ethnography section. He was a man possessed, fueled by lukewarm coffee from a thermos and a stubborn refusal to be denied. He knew he couldn't get the sealed file, but a file is just a container. The information it holds often spills out, leaving traces in other, more public records. He pulled down heavy, leather-bound volumes of parliamentary proceedings from the 1930s, his fingers tracing the gilded lettering. He cross-referenced dates from the censored field report with public records, searching for any ripple that might betray the stone dropped in the secret pond. He scanned microfiches of old Western Australian newspapers until his eyes burned, the ghostly text swimming before him. For hours, there was nothing but dead ends. Then, he found it. Tucked away in an appendix of a dry 1934 census report, under the bland heading Anomalies in Regional Population Metrics, was a small, overlooked table. It detailed a sudden and statistically significant population decline within the Yamachi indigenous community of the Campion district. The dates aligned perfectly with the Emu War. Alistair's heart began to beat a little faster. He read the official explanation, a single, dismissive sentence. The decline is attributed to seasonal tribal migration patterns. Migration, Alistair whispered to the silent stacks. It was a convenient, tidy explanation, a rug under which to sweep inconvenient people, but it didn't feel right. He closed his eyes, picturing the sealed file from the archive, the faint pencil markings he'd glimpsed on its cover sheet. He had jotted them down from memory, a frantic scribble in his notepad. Now, he pulled out the pad. The names he had written down, names like Bulum and Yaran, were not just random marks. They were Yamachi names. They matched the very district, the very year, of the supposed migration. The military operation, the censored reports of unnatural tactics, and the disappearance of an entire group of Aboriginal people were not three separate events. They were one. Alistair's study had become a chaotic map of his obsession. The neat, ordered grid of his old life was gone, buried under an avalanche of paper. Topographical maps of the Campion district were pinned to his corkboard, connected by a web of red yarn. Printouts of census data and newspaper clippings littered his desk. In the center of it all, his laptop glowed, a beacon in the late-night darkness. His methodical, scientific cross-referencing had led him down a rabbit hole so deep he could no longer see the daylight of simple, rational explanation. He had found a digital copy of a 1954 anthropological dissertation written by a Dr. Annabel Croft. It was an obscure work, never widely published, titled Echoes in the Salt, a study of Yamachi oral traditions. For hours he had scrolled through dense academic prose about kinship structures and ceremonial practices. Then he got to the final chapter. A chapter so strange, so out of place with the rest of the work, that he suspected it was the reason the dissertation had been buried. It was titled, The Gool-gool of the Salt Plains, a trickster spirit or a guardian scorned. He leaned forward, reading the words aloud, his voice sounding thin and strange in the quiet room. The Yamachi elders speak of the Gool-gool, a spirit they say, is as old as the land itself, a guardian that can take the form of animals, most often the emu, to protect sacred sites. The stories vary, but they all share one common thread. The Gool-gool is a peaceful spirit, unless provoked. It is said to be angered by the sound of gunfire, seeing the sharp crack of a rifle as a challenge to its domain, an insult to the silence of the land. Alistair stopped, a reflexive scoff catching in his throat. It was folklore, mythology, the kind of fireside tale he had spent his career politely dismissing as cultural artifact, irrelevant to the hard facts of history. It was superstition, plain and simple, yet he couldn't look away. His eyes continued down the page. Dr. Croft notes with academic interest the local accounts of the 1932 military operation. The elders claimed the soldiers did not fight a flock of birds, but a single, angered Gool-gool, which had called the birds to it and confused the soldiers by multiplying its form, creating illusions of a vast and invulnerable army. They claimed the men who vanished during that time were not lost, but were taken, a tithe, paid in blood, for the noise and the violence the soldiers had brought to a quiet land. He sank back in his chair, the words hanging in the air. Illusions, multiplying its form, taken. The phrases echoed the censored report's language of unnatural formations and coordinated movements. It was a perfect, terrifying fit. His rational mind screamed at him, warning him of confirmation bias, of the human brain's desperate need to find patterns in chaos. But the evidence was laid out before him, a chain of causality as clear as any historical timeline he had ever constructed. The farcical war, the censored tactics, the missing people, the ancient myth, they were all linked. The folklore wasn't just a story, it was a hypothesis. A profound shift occurred within him. Alistair Finch, the pragmatist, the debunker, found himself staring at a piece of indigenous folklore and treating it as a potential lead. It was a detail that needed to be tested, to be falsified or proven. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He stood up and walked across the room. On one side, on a pristine section of his desk, lay the printed-out outline for Feather's Folly. Its neat bullet points and logical structure seemed to mock him now, a relic from a simpler, more certain time. On the other side of the room was the glorious, sprawling chaos of the investigation. The maps, the names of the dead, the whispers of a shape-shifting god. For a long moment, he stood between these two worlds. The clean, orderly world of accepted fact, and the messy, terrifying world of possibility. His entire career, his entire identity was built on the former. But the truth, he now suspected, lay in the latter. His decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender. He walked back to his laptop, his movements stiff and deliberate. He opened a web browser. The cursor blinked. The archive was a dead end. The library had given all it could. The texts and the histories had reached their limit. There was only one thing left to do. He typed in the name of an airline. Then, Perth, Western Australia. A calendar appeared. He selected a date for the following week. With a final, decisive click, he booked the flight. The confirmation page loaded, its sterile green checkmark a stark contrast to the mythic horror he was chasing. He stared at the screen, at the digital ticket that would transport him from his world of books and papers into the heat and dust and silence of the Outback. He was no longer just a historian. He was an investigator, and he was going into the field. The transition from the air-conditioned cabin of the airplane to the tarmac in Perth had been a shock. The subsequent 5-hour drive inland was a descent into a furnace. Now, as Dr. Alistair Finch stepped out of his dusty rental 4x4, the town of Campion felt like the very heart of that furnace. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and warped the air above the cracked asphalt of the main street. His city clothes, a sensible linen shirt and trousers, felt absurdly formal, sticking to his skin. He had spent a career in places defined by their silence: libraries, archives, reading rooms, but this was a different quality of quiet. It was not an absence of noise, but a presence of emptiness, vast and unnerving, stretching out to a shimmering horizon. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath. A few rust-eaten signs hung from storefronts, their paint peeled away by decades of unforgiving sun. Finch pushed open the door to the only pub, a set of creaking saloon doors that seemed like a parody of the Outback. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried food. A handful of patrons, leathery farmers with sun-creased faces and calloused hands, sat at the bar. They glanced at him as he entered, their eyes lingering on his clean shoes and soft hands before dismissing him entirely. They turned back to their beers, their silence a solid, impenetrable wall. Alistair cleared his throat, approaching the bar. "Excuse me," he said to the burly bartender, who was wiping down the counter with a dirty rag. "I'm a historian. I was hoping to ask a few questions about the area's history, specifically about the local Yamachi people. Any old stories from the 30s? The bartender stopped wiping. He didn't look up. One of the farmers at the bar let out a low chuckle. "Not from around here, are you, mate?" "No, I'm from Canberra," Alistair said, trying to maintain a friendly academic tone. "We figured," the man grunted, and that was that. The conversation was over. Alistair tried again, asking about old farm boundaries, anything that might lead to a conversation. He was met with shrugged shoulders, monosyllabic answers, and a hostile quiet that made it clear he was an unwelcome intrusion. His credentials, his doctorate, his entire identity as a respected scholar meant less than nothing here. He was just another city man, a tourist in their world, and they had nothing to offer him but their contempt. He finished his warm water, the silence of the pub pressing in on him, and walked back out into the oppressive heat. After 2 days of hitting brick walls in town, Alistair drove towards the modest settlement he de-identified on his maps as the local Yamachi community. It was a collection of simple, prefabricated homes shimmering in the heat, dust devils dancing between them. He felt a familiar knot of academic anxiety, but this time it was different. He wasn't here to observe, he was here to ask for something. He hadn't even parked the car properly before he was stopped. An elderly Aboriginal woman emerged from the shade of a porch, moving with a steady, deliberate grace. She was in her 70s, her face a beautiful map of deep lines, her eyes watchful and piercing. She held a smooth, worn walking stick, not as a crutch, but like a scepter of office. This was Ilara. "You're a long way from home," she said, her voice low and resonant, carrying easily in the still air. Alistair launched into the speech he de-rehearsed. "Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I'm a military historian researching an event that took place here in 1932, and I believe it may have impacted members of your..." She held up a hand, and the simple gesture had enough force to cut him off mid-sentence. "We know why you're here. You're another city man with questions about the past. You want to dig up our pain and put it in one of your books. We have no answers for you." Her gaze was unwavering, and in it, Alistair saw the accumulated weariness of a people who had been studied, catalogued, and dismissed for generations. His academic authority was dust in the wind. His usual methods were useless. In a moment of desperate clarity, he changed tactics. He reached into his satchel, his hand bypassing his carefully organized notebooks, and pulled out the crumpled printout of the missing persons list from 1932. He didn't say anything. He simply unfolded it and held it out to her. Her eyes flickered down to the list of names. He saw a subtle, painful tightening in her expression as she read them. He swallowed, committing to the deception. He pointed to the top of the page. "My great-uncle is on this list," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its academic pretension. "His name was Alistair. I was named for him. My family never knew what happened. I want to know what happened to them." It was a lie, a complete fabrication forged in a moment of desperation. but it was a lie that spoke a deeper truth. He did want to know what happened to them. Ilara looked from the paper back to his face, searching his eyes. The hard shield of her resistance didn't vanish, but a hairline crack appeared in it. She saw not a scientist seeking data, but a man seeking family, a man connected, however falsely, to her own loss. "The past isn't a book you can read, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice losing some of its edge. "It's a wound, and you have to be careful how you touch it." She nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture. "Come. There is something you should see." Ilara led him away from the settlement, their journey taking them deep into the scrubland as the afternoon sun began its slow, dramatic descent. The landscape, which had seemed monotonous and empty, revealed a hidden texture, a subtle language that Alistair was only now beginning to perceive. Ilara moved through it with a quiet familiarity, her walking stick tapping out a soft rhythm on the dry earth. They arrived at a secluded rock formation, a series of massive, rust-red boulders huddled together like sleeping giants. The place felt ancient, sacred. The setting sun had ignited the sky, painting the clouds in violent streaks of gold and deep, bruising purple. The light caught the rock face, and Alistair's breath caught in his throat. It was a gallery. The entire rock face was covered in petroglyphs, intricate figures and symbols carved into the stone centuries, perhaps millennia ago. He stepped closer, his academic mind kicking in despite the awe he felt. He saw depictions of kangaroos, of serpents, and of men with spears. Then he saw what Ilara had brought him here to see. There, carved with undeniable clarity, were tall, slender figures with a distinct profile of emus, but they weren't just birds. They stood over fallen human figures, their postures suggesting dominance, intelligence. And critically, some of the fallen men were holding objects that were unmistakably rifles. Alistair felt a jolt, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. The carvings depicted his precise, obscure area of research. His eyes darted across the rock face, his mind racing. He found the central carving, the one that made the hairs on his arms stand up. It was a being that was both and neither. It had the long legs and feathered body of an emu, but the torso and arms of a man. It stood tall, a figure of immense power, a bridge between two worlds. His scientific worldview, the rigid, empirical framework that had supported him his entire life, shattered into a million pieces. This was not folklore. This was a historical record, carved in stone. The superstition was backed by the hardest data imaginable: archaeology. "These stories are older than your paper, older than your city," Ilara said softly, standing beside him. The Gool-gool was a guardian. It kept the balance, but the soldiers' war, their noise, their fear, it was a declaration of war on the land itself. It didn't kill the spirit, it twisted it, it broke it. And a broken guardian is the most dangerous thing of all. As Ilara's last words faded, the oppressive silence of the Outback was broken. A sound echoed across the plains, low and resonant, a deep, booming drumbeat that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in Alistair's own bones. It was a call that held a chilling, ancient power, a sound no living creature he knew could make. He spun around, searching the horizon. On a distant ridge, silhouetted against the last dying embers of the sunset, stood a line of emus, a dozen of them, perhaps more. But they weren't grazing or moving randomly. They stood perfectly still, like statues. Then, in perfect, horrifying unison, they all turned their heads, not toward the source of the booming call, but directly toward the rock outcrop, directly toward him and Ilara. They stared, their small heads fixed on him, their stillness more menacing than any charge. For a long, unnerving moment that stretched into an eternity, Alistair felt pinned by their collective gaze, felt the weight of a focused, non-human intelligence. Then, as one, they turned and simply vanished. They didn't run or scatter. They melted into the deepening purple shadows of the scrubland with an unnatural speed and a terrifying silence. The booming call faded, and the vast, empty quiet of the Outback returned. But it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was watching. Alistair felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine, a primal fear completely alien to his life of books and archives. The subject of his research was no longer a historical curiosity. It was here, it was real, and it knew his name. The fear from the rock outcrop lingered, but it had recrystallized in Alistair's mind. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of the unknown, but the focused, grim determination of a man who knows the monster is real. The question was no longer if something had happened here, but what. He was no longer a historian studying a text. He was an investigator at a crime scene 90 years cold. And now, he had a guide. Ilara directed him to a part of the scrubland that looked no different from any other, but she identified it as the place the soldiers had made their doomed camp. All that remained were a few crumbling concrete foundations, nearly swallowed by saltbush and spinifex grass. The place felt desolate, haunted by a profound sense of failure. Finch unpacked his metal detector, the modern scientific instrument looking alien in the ancient landscape. He began sweeping the ground in methodical grids, the way he would approach a research paper section by section, leaving nothing to chance. He was using the tools of his world to prove the existence of hers. The machine chirped and sputtered, and his small spade unearthed the ghosts of the past. A rusted belt buckle, a tarnished silver button, and several corroded 303 rifle cartridges, definitive proof that Major Meredith's men had been here, firing their useless guns into the heat. He was beginning to think the site had offered up all its secrets when the detector let out a piercing, solid tone. It wasn't the scratchy signal of surface metal, but a deep, confident hum that spoke of something dense, something significant, buried deeper. He knelt, the sun beating down on his neck, and began to dig into the hard-packed red earth. His spade struck something with a dull thud. He cleared the dirt with his hands and pulled it out. It was a piece of shrapnel, twisted and gnarled from a powerful impact, but it was utterly wrong. It was about the size of his hand, yet it felt impossibly light, almost like aluminum. Its surface was a deep, non-reflective black that seemed to drink the harsh sunlight, and its edges were still razor-sharp, not dulled by the decades underground. It wasn't steel, it wasn't iron, it looked like no metal he had ever seen. He held the impossible object in his palm, a tangible piece of the anomaly, a fragment of the entity that had torn through this camp and the neat pages of history. They were driving back on a lonely dirt track, the strange artifact resting carefully on the passenger seat, when the modern world came crashing back in. A pristine black SUV, its tinted windows hiding its occupants, was parked directly in their path, blocking the road. It was so out of place in the vast, dusty landscape that it looked like a spaceship had landed. Finch's blood ran cold. He knew who it was before the door even opened. Mr. Graves emerged from the driver's side, his stern, bureaucratic face now set in a mask of grim authority. He was flanked by two men who were the very definition of imposing. They wore plain, dark suits that did nothing to hide their coiled strength, their eyes scanning the landscape with a cold, professional vigilance. "Dr. Finch," Graves said, his voice carrying no warmth, no echo of the musty archive. This was a different Graves, a man of action and enforcement. "Your archival privileges have been revoked. You are to cease this line of inquiry immediately." "You have no authority here," Alistair shot back, though his voice trembled slightly. "Don't I?" Graves took a step forward, his eyes flicking to the 4F4. "You are interfering in a matter of national security, a matter that has been contained for almost a century. You will hand over all your research, your notes, and any artifacts you may have found." The word hung in the air. Artifacts. He knew. He had always known. The censorship, the sealed files, it wasn't about protecting the reputation of a few bumbling soldiers. It was about this, about hiding the impossible truth. Finch's mind raced, The dogma of science wasn't just about skepticism, this was about suppression. Graves and his institution weren't trying to find the truth. Their entire purpose was to bury it. As the two agents began to advance on their vehicle, Alara leaned over, her voice a tense whisper. The noise, the confrontation, they're bringing it. The standoff was broken not by a word or a gunshot, but by a sound. The deep, resonant, booming call erupted, but this time it wasn't distant, it was here. It was all around them, seeming to come from the very air, a pressure wave that vibrated through the truck's chassis and into Alistair's teeth. The scrub came alive. It wasn't a charge of solid birds. It was a swarm. Dozens of man-sized shadows detached themselves from the dusk, moving with a fluid, terrifying speed that defied the laws of physics. They poured across the dirt track, silent and relentless. The agents reacted on instinct, shouting in alarm as they drew their pistols. They opened fire, the sharp cracks of the handguns sounding pathetic and small against the entity's booming call. The bullets passed through the shadow forms with no effect, kicking up puffs of dust on the far side of the road. The creatures didn't even flinch. One of the agents screamed as two of the forms converged on him. For a split second, a shape solidified into a nightmarish tangle of black feathers, snapping beak and grasping claws. And then it was gone, dragging the screaming man into the darkness. Graves stood frozen for a single, horrified heartbeat, his face a mask of disbelief as the supernatural horror he had spent his life denying manifested before him. Then the shadows were on him, enveloping him in a silent, swirling vortex. His mouth opened in a scream that was instantly swallowed by the darkness. Alistair didn't think. He acted. He slammed the 4x4 into reverse, spinning the wheel, flooring the accelerator. He grabbed Alara, shoving her down in her seat as if to shield her from the sight. The truck careened backwards, away from the chaos, away from the last fading echoes of the attack. He had just witnessed the ultimate brutal surrender. Modern weapons, institutional power, the full force of the world he knew, all of it was utterly pathetically useless. His only hope for survival now lay beside him, with the quiet woman and the ancient knowledge she carried. The 4x4 skidded to a halt at the base of the rock outcrop, the engine dying with a sputtering cough. The silence that rushed in was thick and heavy, charged with the memory of the chaos they had just escaped. Alistair scrambled out of the truck, his hands shaking, his mind a frantic storm of adrenaline and terror. He fumbled for his phone, the useless black rectangle offering no bars, no signal, no connection to the world of logic and order that now seemed a distant dream. "We have to go," he said, his voice ragged. "We have to drive. We can make it to the highway by morning. We can tell someone." "Tell them what?" Ilara's voice was calm, a steady, smooth stone in the raging river of his panic. She had gotten out of the truck and was now standing at the base of the sacred rocks, her hand resting on the ancient carved stone. That the shadows have teeth. That the land itself rose up to swallow the men who disturbed it. They didn't believe our stories then. Why would they believe yours now? "Then what do we do?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can't just stay here. It will find us." "It already has," she said, her gaze fixed on the darkening landscape. "There is no running from this, Alistair. You cannot run from a fever in your own body. The Gool-gool is not a monster to be killed. It is a fever in the land. It was wounded by your world, and its pain has made it rage. It must be soothed." She knelt, her movements unhurried. From a small pouch at her waist, she took a bundle of dried herbs that released a sharp, clean scent into the air. With the end of her walking stick, she began to draw a large, perfect circle in the red dust around them, encompassing the small fire pit and the spot where they stood. Alistair watched, his scientific mind rebelling against the scene. A circle in the dust, a bundle of herbs. This was the solution. It was superstition, a primitive defense against a force that had torn through men, and metal. His every instinct, honed by a lifetime of empirical thought and problem-solving, screamed at him to act, to fight, to fortify, to do something. "What is my part in this?" he asked, the words feeling foolish as he said them. Alara looked up at him, her eyes ancient and knowing. "You have already done your part. You bore witness to the wound. Now you must bear witness to the healing. You must be still. You must be silent. That is your role. That is your test, to do nothing." It was the hardest command he had ever been given. He, a man of action and evidence, was being told that his only contribution was his passivity. He had to surrender his impulse to control the situation and place his faith entirely in a system of belief he did not understand. He stood frozen, a statue of terrified compliance, as Alara lit the herbs and began to lay them at the edge of the circle. The booming call started again, a low thrum that grew until the very rocks seemed to vibrate with its power. It came from every direction at once, a disorienting, terrifying chorus. At the edge of the firelight, the shadows began to move. They darted and swirled, man-sized silhouettes of emus, their forms indistinct and fluid. They tested the circle Alara had drawn, rushing towards it before pulling back at the last second, like waves crashing against an invisible shore. Alistair's body screamed at him to run, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape. He wanted to close his eyes to block out the sight of the impossible things circling them in the dark, but he remembered Alara's words. "You must bear witness." He forced his eyes to stay open, his terror a physical, nauseating presence in his throat. This was his test. Then Alara began to chant. It was not a loud or dramatic sound. It was a low, melodic hum that seemed to create its own frequency in the night, a sound of calm that pushed back against the enraged drumming of the Gool-gool. She chanted of the land, of the water, of the quiet before the noise. She sang of balance, of respect, of sorrow for a guardian's pain. Slowly, miraculously, the frenzied dance of the shadows began to slow. The booming calls became less frequent, their angry rhythm faltering. The shadowy forms pulled back from the circle, their movements less frantic, more hesitant. One of the larger shadows stopped just outside the circle's edge. It stood perfectly still, and as Alistair watched, breathless, it began to coalesce. The swirling darkness drew in on itself, solidifying. For a single, impossible moment, the form of a giant, grieving emu stood before them, its head bowed. Then the form shifted, elongating, becoming a tall, powerful Aboriginal warrior with ceremonial markings painted on his face. The figure looked at them, and its eyes, the only feature that remained constant in the shifting form, were not filled with malice or rage. They were filled with an ancient, profound sorrow. A guardian-esque grief for the land it had failed to protect. It held their gaze for a long moment, a silent communication of pain and acknowledgement passing between the spirit and the elder. Then the figure dissolved. It did not run or fade. It simply unraveled, turning into a sudden gust of wind that swept through the camp, making the fire flicker and dance. And then there was silence, not the oppressive, watching silence of before, but a deep, true, and peaceful quiet. The booming had stopped, the shadows were gone, the fever had broken. Months later, Dr. Alistair Finch's study was once again a place of order, but it was a different kind of order. The chaotic web of maps and notes was gone, but so was the smug manuscript for Feather's Folly. The room felt calmer, more contemplative. He was carefully packing a simple cardboard box. Inside, he placed his field notes from Australia, the pages filled with his neat, precise handwriting detailing events that no academic journal would ever publish. He picked up the twisted piece of black shrapnel. He ran his thumb over its impossibly smooth surface, the tangible proof of an impossible event. He placed it carefully in the box. Next to it, he placed a small, smooth red stone that Alara had given him before he left. The scientific evidence and the spiritual totem, side by side. He sealed the box with tape. He picked up a thick black marker, and where he might once have written a catalogue number or a formal title, he simply wrote 2 words: private, do not archive. He carried the box to a shelf in his closet, placing it in the back, behind his winter coats. He had returned from his journey with the rarest kind of knowledge, the wisdom to know which truths are not meant to be shared, which stories are not his to tell. The world demanded proof, data, and repeatable experiments. But some truths were fragile, subjective things, witnessed in a circle of dust under a sky full of stars. To expose such a truth to the harsh, skeptical light of his world would not be to illuminate it, but to destroy it. He walked to his window and looked out at the city, at the neat grid of streets and the confident lights of civilization. He used to see a world of simple, solvable facts. Now he saw something else entirely. He saw a world of layers, of depth, of profound and sacred mysteries hiding in plain sight. And for the first time in his life, he was content not knowing all the answers. What a fascinating journey Dr. Finch goes on. He starts as a man we all recognize, someone who trusts in facts, data, and what can be proven. His goal is to bring order to a chaotic historical footnote. But the story he uncovers isn't about order. It's about a much deeper, more ancient kind of truth. What is so compelling is that the story doesn't just pit science against superstition. It shows how they can intersect in unexpected ways. Finch uses his scientific methods, cross-referencing, archaeology, investigation, to lead him right to the doorstep of a myth. The rock carvings are data, the strange shrapnel is evidence, but these facts don't give him a solution. They only deepen the mystery. The real turning point is the climax. In a world that tells us to fight, to solve, to innovate, the answer here was to be still. The solution wasn't a bigger gun or a cleverer theory. It was a quiet ritual of empathy and respect. In the end, Finch's greatest discovery wasn't a monster, but a new kind of wisdom. He finds the story of a lifetime, the proof that would make him famous, and he chooses to lock it away. He chooses to protect the mystery rather than expose it. It leaves me wondering, if you discovered an earth-shattering truth that could not be explained by science, would your first instinct be to prove it to the world, or to protect it from the world?